Welcome back to Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, ExoAcademian. We've rounded the corner of episode 50. We're now on episode 51, Darren. That's feels good. We got some wide open territory in front of us here, some new ground to cover. I'm excited about that. Really excited to have all of you listening, the Liminal Frames friends. Great to have you guys with us on this journey. So, Darren, I think we're continuing in the theme of things are happening, but things are happening slowly in the UFO space. But before we get into some of that and some of the stories we're going to get into today on the episode, I always like to check in with you, see how you're going, how you've been doing. I have been, personally, we talked about allergies a few episodes ago. I've been dealing with that. Things are blooming. It's everywhere, and I'm just fighting it every day. Getting through it, but some days are better than others. So how have you been? Are you enjoying the weather, and what's going on in your neck of the woods?
If you're saying that we are past episode 50, exploring new terrain, it sounds like Area 51 is what you're describing there.
But
drum roll right there.
I like it. Very nice.
Yeah, but in general, I've been appreciating the weather. It's definitely turning a corner in terms of being warmer. And other than that, just being taken by all the strange things happening in the world.
Indeed, a lot of strange things happening, and we're going to get into some of those today. Before we get into that, though, let's kind of talk about some of the recent events that have been happening in the UFO space. Notable things like there was a disclosure rally in New York City, really trying to throw support behind Senator Schumer and the NDA effort that he sort of spearheaded last year. So it's exciting to see folks kind of getting out in the streets, making the case for this, trying to keep the momentum going there. So kudos to those of you who, spent some time and pounded the pavement just to kind of keep this topic alive in the public mind and interest. In addition to that, we're still, I think, dealing and reeling with the fallout from the Ariel report. And, of course, the Kirkpatrick roadshow that followed that as well. He was interviewed and certainly provided some additional comments about that. But, to me, the interesting thing about that Ariel report is we just continue to see so many individuals poking holes in it and how bad it was in terms of its accuracy, its thoroughness, some of the claims that it made and whether or not they were actually true. So, Darren, I don't know, what are your thoughts? We've had a little time to sit with that. What are your thoughts on the Ariel report in terms of, is it going to be something we look back on and kind of think, we really took a hit there, or is it really just going to end up in the dustbin and we're not going to have to worry about it too much?
It's a good question. I've definitely thought about that in terms of where this will land us in a long picture and how we will look back at this in reflection in the future. I think Tim Gallaudet, that we're going to get into some quotes from him later, has shed some interesting insight on how to look at it in terms of it being part of DOD policy ultimately, and that being directed by the White House ultimately. So that's an interesting perspective that he's given from years of experience being kind of in those circles. But in terms of the report itself, I think what is clear is that while this is kind of Project Blue Book all over again, we are living in very different times now than then. And so this is publicly held up to examination, and it's not just being taken apart or called into question, but it's being eviscerated, basically, because it's so poorly written, it's not even self-consistent, and there are so many well-known historical aspects of this entire enterprise that it doesn't even address. So anything that is the most compelling, it just doesn't bring up at all. But that doesn't make that history go away, and at this point, it has so many holes poked in it that there's not much left. It's redaction to the point of not being much there. In fact, Merrick wrote a piece recently in The Hill, and he has a long-standing history here of writing opinion pieces where he basically takes on these DOD-driven kind of narratives. And he said, quote, "The Department of Defense report released March 8th demonstrates that a 7-decade-long trend of official obfuscation and deflection on unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAP, continues unabated. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office's report, a congressionally mandated historical review of U.S. government involvement with UAP, found no evidence of quote-unquote extraterrestrial technology." You and I have talked about that, little way of getting around these things. And he says, while that may be technically accurate, the Pentagon's lengthy report deliberately obscures a critical fact. Official records and public reporting are littered with evidence of unknown craft exhibiting what appear to be extraordinary technology. He then goes on to say, quote, in addition to critical omissions and at least one major misrepresentation, Arrow's report must be scrutinized for its treatment of Captain Edward Ruppelt. Ruppelt was the first director of the Air Force's decades-long UAP analysis and later debunking effort known as Project Blue Book. Despite citing Ruppelt more than any other individual, Arrow's report ignores the countless cases, including many involving simultaneous radar and visual observations that left Ruppelt and the Air Force thoroughly baffled. It goes on really focusing on Ruppelt and what Ruppelt actually noticed in his tenure in terms of how things shifted in terms of policy. Of equal importance, he says, Ruppelt describes an abrupt and profound change in the intelligence analysis process for UFOs occurring in the early 1950s after Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg had decided to reject the quote-unquote interplanetary explanation for UAP. As Ruppelt puts it, analysis subsequently tried a new hypothesis: UFOs don't exist. In no time, they found that was much easier to prove, and critically, it got recognition. Ruppelt continued, before, if an especially interesting UFO report came in and the Pentagon wanted an answer, all they'd get was, it could be real, but we can't prove it. Now such a request got a quick, snappy, it was a balloon, and feathers were stuck in caps and Air Force intelligence up to the Pentagon. In other words, Ruppelt revealed that top officials, not unbiased evaluation, were driving analytic conclusions about UAP. And he finishes, following a purge of intelligence analysts who did not toe the Air Force's new line, Ruppelt described the rise of an anti-saucer faction, which sought to please higher-ups by debunking even the most perplexing incidents. Based on compelling contemporaneous UFO reporting, Ruppelt thought that skeptics should have been changing to believers, but that the reverse was occurring based on improper influence of the analytic process, unquote. So basically he's talking about back in those days, he saw this anti-saucer movement kind of rise up. And because they knew this was real, but they had no way of dealing with it, as we've talked about before, they basically decided, we will bury this. We will say that there's nothing there to see. And anyone who went against that was basically dismissed from their post. So he actually recognizes historically when this happened and basically sees the Arrow report as a further extension of that same kind of policy.
Yeah, I mean, I would remind folks that the word resolution is in the name of the organization. And Kirkpatrick, of course, famously stated that he wants to get out of the business of dealing with this and make it somebody else's problem. So resolving these in a nice, neat, tidy package and explanation as, well, we may have some we don't fully understand, but that's just because we don't have enough data. And if we did have enough data, I can assure you that they're basically prosaic and they fall into one of these known categories. End of story. We're good to go here. And that's really the bottom line of this report and really of the organization itself. So it's going to be interesting. I think it certainly wasn't satisfactory in terms of being transparent or addressing some of these more serious claims. We've also heard from plenty of people who have either gone to Arrow or didn't go to Arrow because they knew they weren't going to be taken seriously. So there's a lot of questions floating around the credibility of this organization, whether they can be trusted, who are they really speaking on behalf of, et cetera, et cetera. And honestly, I'm frustrated by all this because I really want the adults in the room, the people that should have the authority and reach and power to give us more information, give us answers. I really want that to happen. I want this to be taken seriously and to give it a fair shake. And to me, this comes across very clearly as just nothing to see here. We're all done. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Look over here and let's just move on and go about our day. And so that, it is frustrating, perplexing. Hopefully we're going to get additional kind of momentum against that, counteracting that narrative soon. I do think we will. I just don't know exactly how soon that will be.
Right. And we also have some perhaps context that helps us understand how this is happening and why this is happening. And this has come from the lips of Tim Gallaudet. And just for people who don't know, he's an American oceanographer, retired Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and he worked in the U.S. Department of Commerce as well. And he has emerged as a champion of disclosure. And he has talked about things happening behind the scenes that are still moving this forward, just maybe not in the way that people were expecting. And I want to read a quote from him describing why we maybe should expect exactly what we're seeing from Arrow. And this is part of a larger move that ultimately goes back to the White House. So he said, quote, Arrow is part of DOD, and they have to follow DOD policy, which really has to follow the executive branch or White House policy. That's how it goes. I know how this works because I was a senior official in the government's Commerce Department and a political appointed official. And those people at the National Security Council, they take their orders from the POTUS, and the president does not want this to be disclosed because it would just be a huge speed bump for the 2024 election. And so they've made it very clear. This is how the policy and authorities flow in the U.S., that the White House and then the departments, including the Department of Defense. And Arrow is just one office in the DOD, and they're following the Secretary of Defense and National Security Council's lead on policy. And that's the way it works. You never get out of the lane or you lose your job. So basically, he's saying that ultimately this goes back to the White House. Now, you and I have had interesting conversations around the Schumer Amendment, which we have said before very likely was crafted in consultation with the White House. Maybe specifically between Schumer and Biden, we could imagine those kind of conversations being held. And we bandied around the idea that this may have been part of the soft disclosure push, that by crafting this legislation, even if you know it's unlikely to be passed, and maybe even you don't ultimately want it to be passed first time around, it still seeds in the American and the world public's consciousness this notion that these things are real, that they need to be addressed. So slowly but surely over time, you let people become more acquainted with this notion. People like Danny Sheehan have talked about really this is about the 2028 election, that we need to get past 2024, and then there really will be this move towards making this a major issue coming into the 2028 election, which is looking a long way ahead. And right now there's lots of evidence to suggest we're not exactly sure what the world will look like by that point. But nevertheless, that gives us some insight as to what might be happening here behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, and I'm excited for that. At the same time, I get frustrated by sometimes the goalposts feeling like they're being moved. We're hearing a lot about, not this year, maybe next year, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we've talked about this before. I think we're a little bit spoiled in how much has actually happened, and we're accustomed to this rapid pace of revelation, and that's not necessarily been happening lately. And so we're just kind of getting antsy and frustrated that there's not more, that this whole race finally isn't over, that disclosures bingo is happening right now. I think we're a little bit impatient there. So we'll see. I definitely am keeping my eyes peeled to see how that unfolds. This is going to be a particularly interesting year with the election being on the horizon, and it's certainly not going to be a normal election year. So there's going to be some interesting things that we can expect to see in the coming months. But, Tim Gallaudet has been very vocal. He's been very out front in the public about his perspective, really not mincing words. He knows there's something to this. He knows people who are on these legacy programs. He knows senior people involved with the programs, and that they are working together behind the scenes to move disclosure forward in a controlled way. Some really big claims right there from Tim, and given his pedigree, I certainly take those claims very seriously. Will we see some fruits of that labor soon? Maybe we've already seen some of the fruits of that labor. It's just that we don't know who all these players are and what they're doing behind the scenes. We're only seeing what happens, on the public-facing side of things. So very curious to see how that develops, and really big thanks to Tim for sticking his neck out there and being a champion of this topic.
Agreed. And if you think about what he's said from the largest context, it may be summarized in such a way. You could say that he's saying that don't expect it to come through DOD, not just because the DOD wants to cover up their own actions, but also because they're taking their guidance from the White House directly. But the efforts he's working towards are in the legislative branch, which has different calling cards and different goals and those kinds of things, and different people that they're ultimately responsible to. And that relates to something he also said this past week. He said, quote, "Good news on the UAP front. I ran into Representative Luna last night on the Hill, and she asked if I would be willing to testify at a field hearing on USOs, undersea UAP. Of course, I said yes. More to follow," unquote. So what's your takeaway there?
Well, USOs are almost find more fascinating than UFOs because of the extraordinary capabilities that we hear about from people that have had encounters with them. Things like, moving through the ocean at incredible speed, without any sound, just any cavitation. Like, it's just all these kind of interesting performance characteristics. Certainly things that our technology, at least our known technology, doesn't seem capable of doing. So very interesting there. And also because the oceans are just vast. I have to be honest with you, Darren, I'm not a huge fan of the ocean. I like looking at the ocean from the shore. I don't really like being out on it that much. I don't like swimming in it. I don't like this vast abyss below me with creatures that are larger than me doing what they do. That really kind of bothers me. It doesn't allow me to relax. So the ocean is quite large, certainly could be a place where these craft may originate from or may be parked, or all these kinds of different theories that we've heard over the years. Perhaps that's where they are. Most of the Earth is obviously water, and water may be super abundant in the universe. And for all we know, perhaps some of these craft have originated from other planets that are basically water planets. So that could be quite interesting. And that makes me think, too, of the recent sort of Google Maps anomaly that we have seen thrown around. Kelly Chase posted about that off the coast of San Diego, this very strange-looking undersea anomaly that essentially got airbrushed out of the latest version of Google Maps, and there's a lot of speculation as to why would that be? Why go to the effort of removing this structure from the map itself? So a lot of mystery, a lot of questions around USOs. I would love to know more, and I'm hoping we will get to hear more this year.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because, as you say, what is it? Something like 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered by water. We forget that sometimes. And in terms of this anomaly that was spotted, so if people haven't seen it, it's this large kind of rectangular shape. It's very large underwater, and you can see it because you can see the contours rising up on all sides off of San Diego kind of thing. And what's interesting is in the most recent version of Google Maps, it's disappeared. So we know that these Google Earth kind of illustrations and whatnot and maps do get censored sometimes by governmental authorities, that they have this sort of arrangement that, yes, you can chart the Earth, but if we say you have to censor this one part, you have to do that. There's been questions before about structures seen in Antarctica and in the Arctic, right? These kind of pyramidal shapes that seem to be obscured later on, or suddenly less resolution than they used to have, those kinds of things. So we can understand all sorts of legitimate reasons why that would happen in terms of secret U.S. bases and things like that. And of course, this raises the question, is this a secret alien base, or is this a U.S. base? Is this a cooperated base between the two? These are interesting questions. And of course, it happens at a place in our country or off the coast of our country, not just Southern California, but also into Mexico. A lot of the oil rigs in that area report very, very strange activity, even to the point where these oil rig workers off of Mexico will declare they know there's massive structures below that they sometimes encounter, or they see craft coming up. We know that Catalina Island has been central in our investigations about what's going on, and strange happenings have been going on there for decades and decades. So very, very interesting. And I agree, USOs are at least as interesting, if not more interesting than UFOs.
Indeed. Also, we've heard recently along the lines of the legacy programs and crash retrieval. We had an article where Frank Milburn spoke about the fact that he knew some special force operators who were involved with a crash retrieval program in the northern parts of the United Kingdom. So it was a pretty big statement to come out and make, furthering this notion that these programs are in fact real, that they involve really kind of the clandestine elements of our government services, that they have been going on. They're probably still going on. For him to come out and reveal that he knows people who have been in those programs is a pretty big deal. So that's quite interesting. And of course, that also segues into the FOIA request that we heard about from D. Dean Johnson, where there was this whole plan for how crash retrievals would be handled. So that was a pretty interesting announcement there, not really going so far as to say like these things have actually happened, but certainly outlining how that process would work if a crash retrieval were needed to be obtained, what the protocols would be, if there was any sort of engagement with the UAP, what that would look like, how that would be reported on. So certainly some interesting developments there, further adding to the, I think, mounting evidence that these crash retrieval programs are in fact real and did exist and do exist.
Exactly, and they exist across the globe, not just in the U.S., because what many skeptics and debunkers will say is this is just a U.S. phenomenon. This is just evidence of U.S. military tech and things like that. So clearly we know it's not. We have not just Tim Gallaudet recently talking about knowing people directly who are involved in these programs, but we have people like Frank Milburn saying he has direct knowledge of those same programs in the United Kingdom. I spoke with the authorities in Canada last year about programs that were going on there that were known about and cooperation between the U.S. and Canada. And we know this is just the tip of the iceberg. We've also heard about recoveries that have happened in Peru and Brazil led by U.S. authorities, that there's even these kinds of arrangements where, again, elements of the military-industrial complex make arrangements with the militaries of those countries in South America without the governments of those countries sometimes even knowing. It's a direct relationship between the two military groups. Absolutely, this is a worldwide phenomenon and speaks again to what Grush spoke about in terms of there being kind of a new Cold War in terms of this race to try to reverse engineer this technology. But to the point you made about this new FOIA request and it kind of hitting pay dirt, yes, so Dean Johnson, who runs a lot of these FOIA requests, had a really successful attempt here, and he says the following regarding the introductory paragraph of this document he was able to uncover. He says, quote, "The U.S. government has observed a UAP in or near the territory and or operating areas of the United States, of its allies, and of its adversaries, and observing, identifying, and potentially mitigating UAP has become a growing priority for U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and warfighters. The potentially ubiquitous presence of UAP defines the national security implications of those anomalies, which range from operational hazards and threats to technological and intelligence surprise to adversary strategic miscalculations. It is imperative that DoD provide UAP incident, incursion, and engagement reporting data and material for the department's detection and mitigation of potential threats, exploitation of advanced technologies, and informing policymaker and warfighter decisions." He goes on to say a couple of very interesting things. Reports on UAP incidents are to be transmitted upwards within 96 hours, but any UAP engagement reports within 12 hours. A UAP engagement is a kinetic or non-kinetic response to a UAP intended to deny, disrupt, or destroy the phenomenon and or its objects, unquote. What do you make of all of that?
That's some pretty bold language there, and clearly an indication that they take this very, very seriously. It also reminds me of the recent incident that we heard about over above Langley Air Force Base, where there were lots of UAP sighted over a period of time, and they just kind of scrambled this sort of, I think it was a NASA craft to try to do some surveillance on it, a high-resolution craft to understand what these things were. But really we're being told that, we don't know much else about it, and these things just happen, and, oh, well, we're just going to go on with our day. I mean, it really, if you've been paying attention to this topic very closely, this is where you're getting extremely frustrated, and more than frustrated, you're baffled at the fact that we aren't taking UAP more seriously in the U.S. because of their observed presence over some of these very sensitive military and intelligence sites. So why aren't we taking that more seriously? Surely we would have information as to where the UAP may be originating from, because we do have persistent surveillance over most of the world, particularly over parts of the U.S. You would think we would be able to look at that information, use some telemetry data there to figure out where they may have come from, what their source of origin would be. It doesn't seem like we're doing any of that, and we're not really all that keen on understanding it. So that raises a lot of questions, and I would think our lawmakers would be quite frustrated by the lack of answers that they're getting when they're querying the intelligence community about what they're trying to do to investigate these sightings.
It's a good point, and I think the word you're looking for earlier was swarms. That's how they were describing these many, many objects that are kind of referred to as drones, but again, that's kind of a catch-all phrase. There were swarms of these things, and they were completely overwhelmed and unprepared for how overwhelming that would be. And this is testimony given in front of lawmakers, right? So again, it's very perplexing, not only because it makes it very clear this is real, but it also indicates an uptick, a ramping up of activity. We again think of people like Ryan Graves saying that, these things were seen day after day after day for like a year or two. And this is remarkable, right? It's not like these are rare events that, I happened to catch one 6 months ago. These are kind of brazenly involved with our military groups on a daily basis, and sometimes involving swarms of them, which gives you this sense of complete overwhelm where there's no really sense of how do we deal with this? How do we even make sense of this? So you see this language tried to be passed up the legislative branch and whatnot to lawmakers, but no one quite being willing to say what it is. And when you use language like drones, you, of course, introduce the possibility that it's one of our nation-state adversaries. But then again, that in itself would be very daunting because that would suggest they've made some sort of massive technological breakthrough. And then you ask yourself, would they really risk the threat of World War III by so brazenly doing those kinds of things? It doesn't make much sense. So when you read between the lines, and it's not even that many lines you have to read between because it's pretty clear, we're seeing brazen activity from unidentified objects, sometimes in swarms that completely overwhelm our military groups. And this is happening in broad daylight. So this, again, raises really interesting questions in light of everything else that's going on in the world right now. Is this all heading towards some sort of apex moment? Certainly seems that you could make that case. So very, very interesting, and we'll see where the move towards public disclosure goes in light of this. It certainly seems that at some point we're going to have some sort of massive breakthrough, some uptick amongst the mainstream even. When we think about how when people like Kirkpatrick write these op-eds making fun of the entire endeavor, that's quickly picked up by these mainstream publications. But these other eviscerations of the report are not really picked up by those institutions that are part of the mainstream media. When will that change? We shall see as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, and reminder that it's just easier to kind of forget this is actually there. And that's the default position that we already have, right? For most people who are just going about their day, UFOs is a story that they've already resolved in their mind because we've had decades of information saying there's nothing there. So why spend any more brain power on this topic? Because there really isn't anything to it. It's just a waste of time, and it's just something that people sort of spend their free time as a hobby chasing, and it's a conspiracy theory. That's really where we've come. So it doesn't take a lot of work for the powers that be just to kind of spit out a few stories with a few big headlines and say, case closed here, we're done. But even if you take out the sort of otherworldly or non-human elements of this, we still have, as you point out, a very concerning presence of UAP above the United States and sensitive facilities that we need to do something about. We can't just let that happen and not understand what they're doing, what their origin is. And we're being told that, well, we don't know what they are, and if we can just deploy some of these new gremlin sensor packages to these sites, then we'll have the data that we need to resolve them. I mean, I just find that highly unbelievable that we just don't have the right sensor platforms already above many of these facilities to gather information we would need about what these objects might be. I could get it maybe a couple of times, but once they're there and they're in a persistent swarm, I mean, you would imagine we would be able to task the right resources to understand what these objects were, their size, shape, where they're coming from, where they're going. And it doesn't seem like we're doing that, or if we are, it's just not being made public to us.
It certainly only raises further questions, I agree. When you think about how much sophisticated technology we're aware of in the public, that's considerable. But we know that the way that military operations work and military development works, the top secret crafts are generations ahead of what we're even aware of. So that raises interesting questions about how much is really known and how much is the military-industrial complex trying to break it to lawmakers in a way that is palatable when they're actually aware of vast troves of data, specifically demonstrating what these things can do and specifically demonstrating that they're coming from outer space, they're coming from underneath the ocean, right? They might have clear evidence of this, and they're slowly letting this into the public. We shall see. Again, it's very interesting that as you point out, that even if you want to take the argument that this is just other nation states, that alone is incredibly daunting because not just of the technology they seem to have, but the brazen way they would be using it, which could so easily tip into World War III, as if we didn't have enough political strife in the world already leaning that direction. So we shall see where things go and how the mainstream actually engages with this.
We will indeed. And you and I have been exchanging several messages recently about other current events that are catching our eye. Namely, here I'm talking about climate change and just the rate at which the measurements, particularly of like the ocean temperature, are just shattering records left and right, over and over. Not just that we're warmer than we were before, but we're significantly warmer than we were before. We're departing from even the normal trend line increase we had been seeing, and we're even higher than before. So I've heard some of those exchanges that the scientists have analyzed this, and statistically they can't even make sense of it. Like there's no correlative cause for why the numbers are so high, and that alarmingly we might be witnessing accelerated climate change on the order of a couple of decades faster than we anticipated happening. So when you read things like that, and I don't like being an alarmist, but when I read things like that from these dedicated scientists, I become pretty concerned. I mean, this doesn't seem like a good trend, and I recognize there are macro forces at work in the climate, like El Nino and La Nina, and they affect the weather, that kind of thing. So we may see some changes. I don't want to be too alarmist here, but nevertheless, the data is the data, and it is pretty disconcerting when you take a look at it. So we have this element, this one other element that we're dealing with in the world today, among many forces that you and I have talked about. It feels like we're just battling on many different fronts, a lot of conflict. But what do you make of the news that you're reading about the climate and where we are in terms of our ability to even combat that kind of change?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, in light of what you just shared there, in terms of there's multiple issues that capture people's attention, multiple emergencies that are happening simultaneously. And I think most human beings have only so much capacity to entertain those emergencies. And after a period of time, it actually might produce an effect where they tune out because there's just too many emergencies and they feel unequipped to deal with it. But on the climate change front, absolutely. I remember sending you an article that talked about basically we've been setting records for ocean temperature every day for a year. This is completely unprecedented. Even when you see ramp ups or cool downs, you still see that doesn't always follow an exact pattern of every day is worse than the day before. But that's basically what we've seen over the last year with ocean temperatures. And again, not to be alarmist, but we have to be realists. And we know that things like the North Atlantic Current are susceptible to sudden collapse, not gradual, but sometimes sudden collapse. We see this both evidenced in cataclysmic history that I referenced in the last Point of Convergence episode, and that the models also suggest will eventually happen if you have warming. And the North Atlantic Current is very efficacious in terms of warming Northern Europe and cooling South America. So this raises real concerns. This is not just a few degree shift. This is like 30-degree kind of temperature shift in a pretty rapid kind of pace. So these are basically extinction level kinds of threats or close to it. And I mentioned to you that I've said to a few friends lately, we almost need to, like, kind of in an ironic, kind of shocking way, you need to print t-shirts that say extinction level, baby, because we have so many of these events simultaneously arising in our time. And we've never seen this in the course of human history. When you have the real threat of World War III, when there's ramping up of socio-political tensions in the world, you have the threat of global thermonuclear war, which could result in extinction level kind of threats. You have AI. Recently, there was a study endorsed by the U.S. government to look into the potential threat of AI. And what came back in the report was that it was an extinction level threat to humankind. On top of that, we have what you just said, climate change. So all of these things going on, while we're also seeing this ramp up of these others in our midst. And as I've been saying for a while now, I don't think that's coincidental. I don't think that just happens to be the case. I think somehow it's all related. somehow this all comes to a head. I've also mentioned many times, both on this podcast and POC, that New Year's experiencers are sensing something large is coming. It could be any of these, or it could be a convergence of these. We know that 2027 has been mentioned by John Ramirez as a time when intelligence community sources know that these others are going to show up in a plain as day kind of way. Is that because we reach some sort of point where intervention is necessary to prevent the worst of this from coming to fruition? We don't know, but it's clear to me that these things are in the mix. They're well underway already. This doesn't end well unless we make some sort of massive change or there's some sort of intervention that happens. So many things to consider right now, and that's why I think many, many people are just overwhelmed and end up checking out. And I think this is why we really need to practice, meditative practices and whatnot, grounding practices, because undoubtedly this is a very complex time, a challenging time to get through. And we will try to help people navigate these waters moving forward. On top of that, we've got an election year, 2024, as you pointed out. It is unlike any other election in the history of the United States, and that's not an exaggeration. So in the midst of all the things we just said, we also have this near civil war kind of state in the country. So remarkable that all this is happening at the same time. Seems like kind of a final climax in a Shakespeare play or something. We shall see what happens, but I understand that people could be overwhelmed just considering the enormity of it and how many things are happening simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've been accustomed to some relative stability over the last many decades, at least in the West. That's not to downplay, of course, the wars that have been going on around the world almost nonstop for the last, as long as we can count. Just because they're not happening here in the United States specifically doesn't mean they're not taking place somewhere, and that people's lives are being dramatically impacted. But, I do think we have a sense in which the comfortable sort of state that we found ourselves in, or the expected trajectory of Western development, is now being interrupted in a pretty severe way. We're not just going to continue seeing advances and progress and just better and better things ahead of us, that we could very well be facing some catastrophic situations that we're not well equipped to deal with. Most people today don't have any sort of survival skills of any kind, or know how to farm, or anything that would help them stay alive in the event of a breakdown in our infrastructure, our supply chains. We're not well equipped to deal with those things. So it's a very real possibility. I don't like to dwell on it much. I don't like to obsess about that. But I do think it is something that is in the air. It's in the water, so to speak. People are sensing it. And even the young people of today, we're hearing about all the rise of anxiety in our young people, and just how difficult it is for them to navigate the world, in facing all of these challenges that are surrounding them. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that, like you say, we are really being confronted with a change point in our history that you'll be able to look to and say there's a before and there's an after. And, hopefully we can navigate this without too much turmoil and trouble. But, some of those things are within our control, and some of those things are completely out of our control. So we have to learn to sort of go with the flow, right? And that's part of the work that you and I are trying to do here, is, I think, equip people to deal with some of these energetic movements and not necessarily shy away from them, but work with these energetic experiences so that we can come out of that in a better place than just maybe throwing ourselves at the mercy of whatever feelings are coming our way or the way of the world.
Absolutely. And that's largely what inspired Essence of Being for me. And that's what I try to teach in these classes, is not just awareness of these sort of energetic aspects to reality, but how to actually work with them, how to transmute energy. And this is where I think it's really important. We don't get into this that much on this podcast, but to remember and be cognizant of the fact, and have as part of your lived experience, the notion that we are more than just this incarnation. And that even when you have drama happening in this world, it's kind of the polarity of darkness and light. That's how growth happens, is that you need those kinds of things, those kind of polarities to drive growth and understanding. So that is a perspective that's really important to have in the midst of these really trying times, that we don't just become completely alarmist and then perhaps throw our hands up and say there's nothing I can do, to actually rise to the challenge, begin to work with energies, begin to transmute energy, begin to consider how knowing that you are an eternal being having a particular experience as an incarnated human being changes how you embrace whatever we might be facing in the future. While we don't usually talk about those things on this podcast, I think more and more people are recognizing they have to go to that greater level of understanding to make sense of what's happening and to be prepared for what's happening. So I would absolutely encourage people to work on those kinds of things, develop a meditation practice, develop a grounding practice, find ways to tune into this larger scope of who we are so that we can see this in a different context and therefore deal with it a little bit better.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we can learn some things from our past and our fairly recent past and take a look at some pretty famous UFO, UAP phenomenological encounters that I think most of our audience will be familiar with, but maybe take a fresh look at those and discuss the different ways in which we see them in light of our perspective and maybe new ways to think about those events that we weren't necessarily being taught when we've been exposed to them initially. So we've got 3 really mass sightings that we're going to go through here. And the first one is the oldest. We're going to go kind of oldest to newest. And the first one here is the miracle of Fatima, or also known as the miracle of the sun. And I believe that took place in October of 1917. Is that right, Darren?
That's correct. And it was actually a series of events that sort of climaxed in that event, but there were events leading up to it, interpreted one way by the Catholic Church, but then looked at by ufologists in a very different light. One of the questions we'll ask is which one is correct, and perhaps does this lead us to believe that neither one is correct and we need a more transcendent kind of way of considering these kinds of events. Quote, in 1917, Fatima, a small town in Portugal, became the site of one of the most significant religious events in modern history, known as the Fatima apparitions. These events occurred over a series of months and involved 3 young shepherd children, Lucia dos Santos and her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto. The events at Fatima are regarded by Catholics as one of the most important Marian apparitions of the 20th century. Here's an overview. The first apparition was on May 13th, 1917. The children reported seeing a vision of a lady, quote-unquote, brighter than the sun, while they were tending their family's sheep. The lady urged them to return to the same spot on the 13th of each month for 6 consecutive months. The children described the lady as, quote, more brilliant than the sun, shedding rays of light clearer and stronger than a crystal glass filled with the most sparkling water and pierced by the burning rays of the sun, unquote. Subsequent apparitions, June 13th, July 13th, August 13th, September 13th, culminating October 13th, which you mentioned. On each of these days, the children reported seeing the apparition of the lady. During these apparitions, the lady allegedly revealed herself to be the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, though we will get into that. Did that really happen? Continuing, she imparted messages to the children, including calls for prayer, penance, and devotion to her Immaculate Heart. Did that really happen? We'll go into that. She also revealed 3 secrets to the children during the July apparition. Now, the miracle of the sun, the event you mentioned, happened on October 13th, 1917. This was the most famous event associated with the Fatima series of events and was witnessed by a crowd of approximately 70,000 people. So you talk about a mass sighting. This is as massive as it gets, basically, although we will get to ones that have to be more, maybe. According to numerous accounts, including reports from skeptics and journalists present at the scene, the sun appeared to dance, change colors, and spin in the sky. This event, known as the Miracle of the Sun, was seen by many as a confirmation of the children's visions and drew widespread attention to Fatima. Now, regarding the content of the secrets, the 3 secrets revealed to the children were evidently disclosed by Lucia, the eldest of the 3, in her memoirs. The first secret was a vision of hell, which terrified the children. The second secret was a call for the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary to prevent the spread of communism and its errors. The third secret was initially kept secret by Lucia, but was eventually revealed by the Vatican in 2000. It included a vision of a pope being killed and other symbolic events interpreted as reflecting the sufferings of the Church in the 20th century. Finally, the Fatima apparitions sparked widespread interest in Portugal and beyond. The site of the apparitions, the Cova da Iria, became a pilgrimage destination, and a sanctuary was built there. The three children experienced significant personal hardships following the apparitions, including the deaths of Francisco and Jacinta due to the Spanish flu pandemic in 1919 and 1920, respectively. Lucia later became a nun and lived to a venerable age, passing away in 2005.
Well, I'm fascinated by this encounter and the range, the frequency of the encounters. It really piqued my interest, and I know that Diana Pasulka mentioned this event in her first book, and I'm also fascinated by it because of Chris Bledsoe. You know, if you're familiar with Chris Bledsoe's story and his encounters with the lady, you start to see these sorts of parallels here between the lady of Fatima and the lady that he witnessed, being of light, right? And how the individuals that experience this being tend to come away with some sort of feminine qualities of the being. And then, of course, the natural connecting point in modern time to, a divine female in the West would be, the image of Mary, Mary an apparition. So there's a little bit of a contextual, cultural overlay happening, in that exchange. I think it's not as simple as this literally is Mary appearing to these children, that it's this part of the cultural milieu that they happen to be in, and they're overlaying that on top of the encounter. So that really fascinates me, particularly as someone who is a student of religion and grew up with a Christian faith. Really interesting components to that. Certainly because I also grew up thinking that miracles were really just kind of fancy stories. They weren't actually things that really happened. And so here we have an experience, well documented, experienced by thousands and thousands of people. It's hard to ignore the truthfulness of that encounter. It's not just sort of mass, hypnosis, although I think it has been cited before as an example of, a mass hysteria, mass hypnosis kind of experience, which I highly question.
Yeah, there's so many interesting aspects, as you point to. And to that last point you made about the 70,000 people, what's also fascinating about that is many of those were skeptics and debunkers, even identified atheists who showed up to sort of laugh at the whole thing. It's like Mick West showing up at the encounter and then having this profound event, right? So that was interesting, that it seems like everyone on the scene had an experience, even though, again, there were some differences, some distinctions in what they described seeing and experiencing. Furthermore, different astronomical and meteorological centers around the world said there was nothing unusual that they recorded during that time. So we have this case again where in real time, vast numbers of people can experience something, and yet our sensor systems don't pick it up, which, to your point, could mean some sort of mass hypnosis. It could also mean a direct manipulation of 70,000 people's consciousness without actually impacting sort of space-time for everyone else outside that context. And even that's just a guess, right? So it creates so many interesting questions about what was happening here, what was the mechanism, that kind of thing. It definitely challenges some of our understandings about reality. Now, regarding this event, as we've already pointed to, what's interesting about it from a historical point of view is the people in that area were largely Catholic. There was many, many Catholics in the area. And so when you have any kind of female-looking humanoid figure that looks dazzling and brings a message, it's going to immediately be interpreted as the Mother Mary, as a Marian apparition. And indeed, the Catholic Church actually launched a full investigation, a long, pretty detailed investigation, before concluding that it was a legitimate Marian apparition and now is regarded that way. And you can go there, and many Catholics every year go to that area to basically celebrate and remember this event. But of course, there are other people who look at not just what we've discussed here and not just the messages from this being, but also looked at other events that happened around that event in terms of the kind of craft that were seen in the sky, the way that those craft behaved. And they noticed some real parallels with what other kinds of cases that have always fallen within the so-called UFO phenomenon. So this raises questions about, is this better fit in that kind of category? And people like Jacques Vallée have taken this on in some of his books. I want to quote from a book called Heavenly Lights, The Apparitions of Fatima and the UFO Phenomenon. This is a really fascinating book by a couple of guys who did a detailed analysis. This really breaks it down sort of point by point and points out that you can see it from either perspective, really. But to your point that you began with in saying that because this was subject to a kind of overlay, an interpretive overlay, they get into this in this opening section here. The day of May 13th. "Oh, Mother, I saw Our Lady," affirmed Jacinta upon her return home on May 13th, 1917. Soon a lonely and rocky part of the parish of Fatima, where not a single family resided, would become the wellspring of hope for believers, the center of attention for newspapers, the source of agitation for politicians. Portuguese history found on that Sunday afternoon another course, perhaps even a new destiny. Quote, "If the kids saw a woman dressed in white, who else would she be but Our Lady?" asked Antonio dos Santos, as if to himself. So there's the first sign that this overlay comes in very easily. Antonio was Lucia's father and the brother of Jacinta and Francisco's mother. The heavenly visitor, however, did not disclose her identity to the little shepherds. Naturally, for a girl named Jacinta, born into an ancient Celtic civilization, the Blue Lady would be Bellissima, also known as Minerva, a goddess of light and fire for forging and craft, who in that tradition was, quote, the being of the flame. For Jacintas who lived in Syria, Greece, Rome, and Bolivia, she would have been one of the other feminine deities who have descended from the sky, such as Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, and Oriona. In truth, in 1917, it could be no other. Lucia, however, the principal seer and the one who dialogued with the quote-unquote lady, was not convinced of that. She remained quiet. Maria Rosa, her mother, who believed little in the supernatural, learned of the visitation and decided to question her daughter about the alleged apparition of the previous day. She said, "Lucia, I heard it said you saw Our Lady at Cova de Iria," her mother asked. And Lucia answered, "Who told you so?" "It was Jacinta's mother, whose daughter told her. Is it true?" Lucia corrected, "I never said it was Our Lady. Rather, a small, pretty lady. I even asked Jacinta and Francisco to say nothing. They could not hold their tongues." "A small lady?" the mother said. "Yes, Mother." "Then speak up and tell me what the lady told you." And she responded, "She told me that we should continue to go there for 6 consecutive months on the 13th of each month, and that at the end of that time, she would tell us who she was and what she wanted of us," unquote. So this is a remarkable case, and here we clearly see this kind of overlay, and the author makes the point that if she was from a different kind of country, a different kind of overlay would have applied. But what's interesting is while Jacinta came home, and even after the 3 children had agreed not to say anything, she babbled to her mother and her father right away, "I've seen Our Lady," and she, of course, means the Mother Mary. She interpreted it that way. But Lucia, who was actually the one that dialogued with the lady, was the one who clarified she never identified herself that way. But she did set up this kind of leading to go back every month on the 13th for 6 straight months, which in itself is fascinating. Love to get your take on that, because how many other cases of the UFO phenomenon, or Marian apparitions for that matter, do we have this consecutive meeting with these supernatural beings for months on end?
Yeah, very few, at least very few that we know about publicly. We certainly know of individuals who've had experiences like this where they've had ongoing contact with beings, but it's been very private. It's not been something that has been relayed to larger groups of people. Certainly not a group of 3 individuals going to meet with a being and doing that with any kind of regularity that we know about. There aren't many examples of that. And, to your point, I think it's fascinating to me that there's an immediate need, a rush to sort of fill in some of the blanks with this fantastical encounter and make it fit into a certain mold that is more comfortable. We're good at doing this. We're good at kind of taking little information and then slotting that into things that we're already familiar with, into stories that we already know. And that happens quite a bit in the lore in UFO history. Many examples like this. And you can go back, and you did a great job on your recent Woodham Convergence podcast. Encourage folks to listen to that, just in the ways that in biblical history, religious history, people will take events that have occurred, that have been experienced, and then they'll rewrite them, or they'll recontextualize them in more palatable ways, or in ways that are more well understood by the readers and writers of that particular day. So that they're bringing their own kind of culturally situated selves to that experience, and then rewriting it and changing it. And then oftentimes that becomes what really happened, even though that's not actually what took place. I think that this is a great example of that. And it does, for me at least, reopen my mind, my eyes to history, to events that have taken place in human history, and looking at all of those experiences that have been recounted in our mythologies, etc., with a fresh perspective, and asking, is this all part of the same thing? And have we just happened to have, created and crafted these different narratives along the way that have been very culturally situated? And that, I think that's what has happened, and this allows me to redeem those experiences and look at them from a fresh perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And really, this questions, I think, some of the categories we have available that we tend to slot these things into. For instance, when I discussed different historical moments that have been recorded in biblical history, for instance, we often think either this is a god or this is an ET. So with those two notions, we have the notion that either it's coming from an extra-dimensional kind of frame where it's limited to God and angels and Satan and demons, versus the extraterrestrial hypothesis that would say that they're coming from some other star system and are visiting here and nuts and bolts craft, etc. But both those cases I cited in the Point of Convergence episode, and here with Fatima, this kind of gets challenged, because are these beings really acting like nuts and bolts beings coming from a different star system? Not really. Are they acting like beings that you can attribute to Christian history and they're going back to heaven afterwards? Not really, right? Because what's interesting, people like Jacques Vallée, as well as the two gentlemen that wrote this book, talk about some of the other sightings of craft, like I mentioned. One of them involving craft that seem to be disguising themselves within clouds, right? So this is actually a kind of cloaking device, you could argue, right? That it looks like something you could hide your presence, which looks like a kind of technology, could be considered as a kind of technology, right? We also have mention of this falling leaf pattern for some of these craft, that they would fall as if what we see with a dead leaf that falls in a sort of swinging kind of motion, zigzagging down towards the earth. That's what was noticed here. That has also been recognized with cases that fall typically within the UFO phenomenon. But what's so fascinating about this case is that neither one is really a good fit, which I think makes us ask more overarching questions about our model of reality. I think this notion of there being different dimensions of reality, and that's just a way of framing these different overarching contexts that interpenetrate but are also somewhat independent of each other, that there are beings that don't necessarily have to adhere to or be limited to the same constraints we do as three-dimensional beings in this construct, who seem to show divine-like powers. They are deity-like in that sense, but they don't fit within the typical monotheistic framing of God in heaven with angels and Satan in hell with demons. So that's when I think about this case. What's so fascinating about it is it demands deeper questions. It makes us question what we have available, and really represents the poverty of our imagination in terms of what categories we make available to spot these things into.
Yeah, and to put a real fine point on something here too, just like we're kind of critiquing, or at least I think exposing the way in which the individuals of that day interpreted the experience in light of a Marian apparition, and we're saying, oh, look at what they're doing, it's so obvious, they're putting that in that Marian context. Well, hey folks, we're doing it too. We're putting it in a ufological context, and some of us might look at that and go, oh, it's an extraterrestrial, it's an interdimensional being. The point here is that we're always applying a kind of overlay onto the experience, trying to map that to something that we're comfortable with, that we think is more has greater explanatory power for us. But I think what you and I are trying to urge people to do here is kind of go beyond just that initial knee-jerk mapping process and try to think more broadly about what is this indicative of about reality itself? What is this representative of about how reality functions, that this kind of experience can take place in what we would call, quote unquote, normal human experience. And it certainly falls outside the bounds of normal human experience that we're comfortable with. But the fact that it's happening over and over again and happening to thousands of people, maybe it's more normal than we like to admit. And maybe we just sort of relegate these experiences to these neat little mythological buckets and think, oh, like these are cute little stories that happen every once in a while, when in fact they're really part and parcel to the human experience itself.
Right. And I think another key point to highlight here is the messages themselves. And to use kind of a Vallée-esque kind of perspective here, how that changes us. So regardless of the ultimate origin that we attribute this to, it does change us. This inspired Catholics to see this in a certain way, but it also inspired actions. And we have talked before about, and Vallée has talked before about, perhaps they use our cultural expectations to shape their presence in such a way that we are able to metabolize the message they're giving us. So in other words, they will take on different guises over time that will be palatable to us, but ultimately for the sake of trying to change the course of our civilization. So that definitely happened here. There was this kind of recognition that the West needed to make peace with Russia, for instance, that kind of thing, which not only was this happening at the time of World War I, but we knew that what lay ahead of us was World War II and then the Cold War. So it's almost as if these beings had a larger horizon of time. And because of that, they were actually trying to prepare humanity for a better course. They were literally trying to perhaps use elements of the day, but with the aim of changing the course of human civilization, which very much fits with a control system hypothesis in a way. Now that also fits into this next case that we're going to get into, which is this case with the Ariel School in Zimbabwe, which also famously included messages about what humankind should do, how we should change course. So again, there was a purpose. It wasn't just random. Now, to give a quick summary here, although most people will know this case, several children at the Ariel School in Zimbabwe reportedly witnessed a UFO landing on the school grounds in 1994. They claimed to have seen strange beings emerge from the craft. Despite various theories and investigations, including those suggesting a mass hallucination or a prank, the children maintained their accounts of the event years later, asserting the reality of what they saw. The children reported receiving messages from the beings that emphasized the importance of taking care of the earth and its environment. The beings allegedly conveyed warnings about humanity's destructive actions and urged the children to be mindful of their impact on the planet. Alongside their messages about environmental stewardship, the beings reportedly cautioned the children against becoming overly reliant or obsessed with technology. They emphasized the importance of maintaining a balance and not allowing technology to overshadow essential aspects of human life and the natural world, unquote. So a fascinating account, not just because it's so compelling that so many of these kids saw this. These kids now are adults, and some of their engagement with this entire event is still recounted now as adults. And there was a recent movie that was put out that many have seen that speaks to this and follows one woman's particular case and how it's changed the course of her life entirely. You see, even as an adult in her 20s, her room is filled with her own drawings, recreations of this event. It's completely changed her life. And also I'd point out that many of those kids received very similar messages to what many of the abductees involved in John Mack's research also received. And what both the kids in Zimbabwe that are now young adults, as well as those people that were involved in the 90s abductions that are now older adults, will say is that definitely what we see is the trajectory that was warned about is exactly the trajectory we've taken, and many of them wonder if it's too late. We didn't heed these warnings. But what do you reflect on when you think about not just how compelling that event was in terms of the evidence, but also how the messages were so central?
Yeah, I think in particular here, who is the message for, right? I had the chance to interview Randall Nickerson, who produced that film, Aerial Phenomena, and you can tell how much of his heart and soul have been poured into that production. And while we were talking, it occurred to me that, and this is just the nature of these events in general, we tend to kind of, at first pass, we think about how they occurred in the past. They don't they occur to these individuals. The messages that were delivered then are for those individuals. But the fact that the story itself is being told now, right, and the message that was conveyed then is being told now in the retelling of the story, I begin to think, who is the message for? It's for us now, more so even than it was for them. Yes, it was a cautionary tale. Be careful about becoming too technologied. I think it was the phrase that was used. But if you look back and think back to that time, that the mid-90s, basically, yes, we have more technology, but really compared to now, like not much at all. So giving that message to children who are going to grow up in a world that is increasingly technologied in their lifetime, and look at where we are now, where most of us carry around a device that we spend a good portion of our day looking at, that message resonates even harder today than it would to those children then, who, by the way, lived in Rua, Zimbabwe, as close to nature as you basically can get. I mean, they're right there in the natural world. So they're not like they're living in some amazing, technological complex with all of these computers everywhere. I mean, they're already living close to nature. So this message given to them then is a little bit strange, but when you put it in the context of us observing it now, at least from my perspective, it becomes more clear, takes on greater meaning, and speaks to the way in which these encounters, these messages are dynamic, that they really do change depending on when you're hearing it, what you're observing, where you're situated. All these factors come into play. Getting to that point that we've made before, that time and space, there's more going on than just that pure linear progression of time and space, that these things are much more multifaceted and dynamic than we tend to think.
Absolutely. And many of those kids will point out that much of the land around that area has been clear-cut since then. And that speaks to the environmental concerns. You and I just finished talking about climate change and the challenges that entails, and how that's directly connected to our lack of stewardship of the environment, which is exactly what the beings were warning about. And again, to hammer home this point, they seem to have a much broader horizon of time that they can see. So they perhaps were speaking from an awareness of our future, which has now become basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we just finished talking about these multiple extinction-level events that seem to be arising in our time, which are pretty much connected to those messages. When we think about don't become too technologied, what does that mean? Perhaps that refers to AI. Perhaps it refers to this notion of handing over the reins, whether consciously or unconsciously, to this incredibly powerful system that might never become conscious, but it can still become incredibly intelligent and become to outpace by far our ability to even track what it's doing. So these concerns, these messages that were raised in the 90s, directly have parallels in our time now, absolutely. And one other point to make about who is the message for, I also raised this in my talk at the New York Anomalous Conference, that one thing that occurred to me that seemed to really resonate to me was that, and Jung talks about this, Carl Jung talks about this, the sense of the collective unconscious, that when any human being experiences a particularly impacting event, it also gets seeded into the collective unconscious, and therefore all of humanity can draw from that. So many people have asked, to bring up our last episode, for instance, why did this happen to Joe Simonton, this farmer? Why him and not, why did they land on the White House lawn? Why did these beings land at a primary school in Zimbabwe, of all places, when they could land on the White House lawn or speak directly to politicians or people that actually are in a position to make some policy changes? But perhaps they know more than we do even about that. And perhaps what's happening is a seeding into the collective unconscious, so we all become aware of this. And that slowly this temperature has risen, again, to use the analogy of climate change, in terms of our awareness of these issues, perhaps leading to some sort of change. Perhaps because they do see with a much broader horizon than we do. They know what they're doing, perhaps. It's hard to know. But it's certainly fascinating, and it really is eerie how much this parallels exactly what's happening in our time.
It really does. I think if you haven't seen that film, you owe it to yourself to go and watch that Ariel Phenomena film. It's excellent. And I think of all of the encounters, the modern day UFO encounters that we hear about, that one resonates very strongly on a human level. Is the connection that those children had with those beings, the messages that were conveyed. It's very, very powerful, very, very moving. And I think, as we've talked about, very relevant for our time today. So the last event that we're going to talk about here that also happened in the 90s, closer to the late 90s, was the Phoenix Lights event that took place March 13th, 1997 in Phoenix, Arizona, in Arizona, Nevada, that kind of area. So Darren, you want to kind of get into some of the details around that particular sighting?
So this is the general description of that event. The Phoenix Lights referred to a series of widely reported unidentified flying objects, UFOs, observed in the skies over the U.S. states of Arizona, Nevada, and the Mexican state of Sonora on March 13, 1997. The event gained significant attention due to the large number of witnesses and the duration of the sightings. Here are some key points. Initial sightings. The first sightings were reported around 7:30 p.m. MST in the vicinity of Paulden, Arizona, north of Phoenix. Witnesses described seeing a formation of lights in a V-shape or boomerang pattern. These lights were described as stationary or moving very slowly. Then we had the expansion of sightings. Reports of similar lights came in from various locations across Arizona and even from neighboring states like Nevada and Sonora, Mexico. Witnesses described the lights as large and distinct, with some saying they saw a solid object behind the lights. Then we have the duration of the sightings. The duration of the sightings varied. Some witnesses reported seeing the lights for a few minutes, while others claimed to have observed them for over an hour. Then we have the media coverage. The event received significant media coverage, with news outlets across the country reporting on the sightings. Video footage and photographs taken by witnesses further fueled public interest in the phenomenon. Then we have the government response. Initially, the U.S. Air Force suggested that the lights were likely flares dropped by an A-10 Warthog aircraft during a training exercise at the Barry Goldwater Range in southwest Arizona. However, this explanation was met with skepticism by many, as witnesses described the lights as being in a stationary formation. Then we have subsequent investigations into the Phoenix Lights have yielded various theories, including weather balloons, we've heard that before, military aircraft, experimental aircraft, or even extraterrestrial activity. However, no definitive explanation has been provided, and the event remains a subject of debate among UFO enthusiasts, skeptics, and researchers. Over the years, there has been attempts to recreate the Phoenix Lights using aircraft, balloons, and other methods. However, none of these experiments have been able to fully replicate the phenomenon witnessed in 1997. The Phoenix Lights event remains one of the most famous and well-documented UFO sightings in modern history. It has sparked ongoing interest in the study of UFOs and has been the subject of documentaries, books, and films.
Yeah, the documentary there that you might want to check out is called I Know What I Saw. That's a James Fox film, one of his first, I think, that really covered this event in particular. And that statement really hits home for me. I know what I saw. And he interviewed various individuals that had firsthand eyewitness of the object. Unmistakable what it was to them. And to have so many individuals who don't know each other corroborating the same kind of object, same kind of movement. Notable as well, you talked about media coverage or media reaction. We certainly had the governor of Arizona, Fife Symington, who really downplayed the event afterward and kind of brought in one of his legal or his aides dressed in the giant alien costume to kind of laugh about the whole thing. But then he later on apologized for making light of that issue because he himself had a sighting of the same object. So an undeniable experience, and he has since became an advocate in investigating what that really was. So this is a great example of a modern mass sighting, thousands and thousands of people. The fact that it was seen from so many locations also, I think, speaks to its size. I've driven through Arizona and Nevada. It's a wide, flat territories there, big sky, and the fact that you could see the object from a long distance away, a neighboring state even, is really remarkable. So this is quite an experience, and I think for me, as we wrestle with it, it falls into that same category of, our knee-jerk need and reaction to just quickly debunk this. Like, this can't possibly be what I see. I know what I see. It can't possibly be that, because that is outlandish, and I've been told that isn't even possible within the realm of possibility. So I'm going to discard it altogether. I'm going to almost forget that I saw it, because remembering it or focusing on it is cognitively harder than just letting it go, because letting it go is the default position we have for these kinds of experiences. So, I love this encounter. It's really, really fascinating. Of course, you and I were alive during the Ariel School and alive during the Phoenix Lights encounter. Would have been amazing to be there and experience that. I think that's something that I certainly would like, having not had an experience. It would be cool to see that in the sky.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case and different than the other two cases we covered, because in this case, there were not messages, right? There was not an actual landing and the seeing of beings and those kinds of things that were part of the other two events we cataloged here. But what's very interesting about this is how modern it is, to your point, 1997, where we have a modern media where this was not only videoed and photographed, but the media really covered it in a pretty strong way. And what many people have pointed out is that if we had a Phoenix Lights incident today, where everyone is carrying a cell phone with a high-quality camera, we would have basically disclosure in a moment, because we would have undisputable proof, basically. That is argued. Now, it's interesting, too, what you brought up with the governor, because you think about human psychology there, right? So we have here a governor who witnessed himself this event, and yet, to Nathan's point, when he actually held the press conference, he did the whole scoff, ridicule, this is a laughable moment, this is an X-Files moment. He had his staff show up in these alien costumes, and sure enough, the response was laughter amongst the reporters. So without actually saying anything, what you communicate in terms of, again, neurolinguistic programming is, we know this is not real, this is funny, we can all have a laugh together. Because at the moment, he probably felt completely overwhelmed. Most officials probably felt completely overwhelmed. How do you address this? What does this say of our ability to patrol our borders and to control our airspace? That suddenly these craft in this kind of formation could be seen stationary for long periods of time over a massive metropolitan area. This is not something you want to admit to when you have no way to explain it, nor explain how it was able to happen without you having any ability to stop it. So that's fascinating. And yes, as you point out, he later was very apologetic, realized he was part of the problem in continuing the stigma that day. And to his credit, he has since, like you said, become an advocate for disclosure and really investigating these things. But what's particularly fascinating about it also is when we think about this whole notion of seeding into the collective unconscious, these different events, that one stands out. It's one of these moments in history, in human history, and specifically American history, where we go, oh yeah, remember that event? That was a mass sighting. That wasn't in some obscure place in the desert or up in the mountains. This was over a major metropolitan area, moving slowly. So even when people make the case for what if this was just top secret military craft, why would you move slowly over a massive metropolitan area, displaying your capabilities, giving away secrets about the way they were shaped, the way they perform, etc.? That's not what you usually do with top secret black budget aircraft. So who knows what it was, but it's certainly seeded into our consciousness an awareness that these others can, when they choose to, show up in a massive way over a major metropolitan area. And what's so interesting about this case is that it's the one that stands out from the rest, where we say, why don't they show up in a plain as day way? Well, they kind of did. It was at nighttime, but it was over a major metropolitan area, and many, many people saw it, photographed it, and videoed it. So in that sense, it stands out as a really remarkable case in ufological history.
Mm-hmm. I think it's one of those cases where if you had the keys to the vault, you could get in there and get what the government has on this object, what they may have collected that day, it would be really fascinating to see the government's files on whatever this happened to be. And I think this speaks to really just the frustrating aspect of these encounters generally, right? We have, certainly in our modern time, an apparatus that has tremendous data collection capability and presence. It's not just that we have the sensors. We're pretty much everywhere that you would need to be to observe the sky and things that are going on, right? So it would be really amazing for us to have access to whatever they happen to have there. The data that they have, information, the investigations that they may have done, and we don't have that. So it's super frustrating for us, I think, now looking back at an event like that with so many people having seen it, to say, geez, where's the rest of this information? And here we are, today, as we discussed earlier on the show, talking about Arrow and supposedly their history of UAP encounters and kind of telling us the history that they want us to know, and feeling like we're not getting the whole story. And I think that that's really the frustrating aspect of the entire enterprise here, is that we're being told officially there's nothing to see here, and to just let this go, to ignore it, to move along, all the while we have so many, incidents like Phoenix Lights, like the Ariel School, where clearly something did happen. We have witnesses who saw something extraordinary, out of the norm. And when you have those stories over and over and over again from different parts of the world, different kinds of individuals, all walks of life, you can't ignore that. You can't just say, like, this is some strange, broad mass type of psychosis, because it wouldn't make sense for it to be repeatable in the way that it is, right? You could see all kinds of different psychotic events taking place, but the nature of those events would be pretty disparate based on, what those individuals were, their historical background, and the fact that we're not seeing that. We're seeing, similarly described craft, similarly described occupants. So all of these things, when you add them up, to me, make a very clear, very plain case. There is clearly something going on that we are going to have to wrestle with. And maybe that's what we're coming up against, is that point now, maybe this decade even, where we're finally going to come to grips with these events and gain a little bit greater understanding about what they mean, or what they point to, how they're related to the human experience.
Yes, and I think what's also interesting about each of these cases is that only one of them took place in the United States. So as much as we hear skeptics, debunkers saying this is just evidence of either fantastical notions amongst an American public that's gullible, or advanced black budget tech operating over American skies, this is not the case in Fatima, Portugal. This is not the case in Zimbabwe. And what's also interesting is that while we do see commonalities amongst the kind of craft described and the beings, there's also distinct differences sometimes. So what's also interesting about this is that we can't just slot it in as one more aspect of our understanding of life in the cosmos and life present on the planet. We actually see many different kinds of beings with different kinds of origins. And perhaps the fact that they often share the same kind of messages, the same kinds of warnings, the same kinds of admonitions, speaks to just how real this is. This is not just some notion they've come up with to scare us or to control us, but they actually all share this understanding of a more expansive understanding of seeing into the future, our relative future. And they're trying to warn us about it because, again, we assume we understand what's present in our biome. But we've heard about this notion of a shadow biome, all these different kinds of beings, intelligences that exist right alongside us, even though we don't usually perceive them. And we think about the work of Donald Hoffman and people like that, where they make it clear that we only perceive a translation of a truncated aspect of reality. So when that comes clear, we realize that our actions may have prompted these beings to become more visible over time, to send these messages, because our actions have implications not just for us, not just for the planet, not just for the animal kingdom, the plant species, but also for these many others that are around us. So I think it's very interesting when you think about, again, the place we are in as a civilization, the challenges we face, the fact that disclosure seems to be being pushed, even if it's kind of a push and pull kind of dynamic. Again, that raises that question that we've often voiced on this podcast. Why now? If the Project Blue Book kind of policy is standard policy, why is there also this counter push towards getting this out? Again, you could make a strong argument that it's because we are coming to some sort of key point in our future. We have seen how, for instance, some of these beings will shoot down our nuclear warheads, even when they're just dummy warheads, demonstrating that they are not going to put up with this. They have shown remarkable capacity to show up over our nuclear weapons facilities and shut down silos. Is that a message to us? Perhaps. Is it them testing to make sure they can shut those things down in the instance of a nuclear war? Could also be that. But somehow, again, all of this is connected. That's what I think is so fascinating. And it may result in what we haven't yet seen, which is a plain as day sighting of these beings where we all become aware of them. Again, we are hearing even people from official circles in their background, people like John Ramirez, saying not only is that expected, but it's known that this is something that they are preparing for. And in light of the multiple extinction level events we are facing, we can understand that intervention would make sense now, perhaps more than any other time in human history, because it's necessary for the very ongoing presence and survival of not our species, but so many of the species that cohabitate with us in this larger biome.
Yeah, and when you look at the totality of these experiences, you certainly could speculate that they've been doing their best to try to get our attention, right? They've been trying all kinds of different methods of connecting with the human population and getting the message across. You know, they're trying it through our spirituality, our mythology. They're trying it through our technology. They're trying it through all these different, they're trying it through our dreams, trying through all these different means to get us to wake up and pay attention to what's going on. And for whatever reason, we're just not getting the message, just can't get through our thick skulls. So perhaps that moment is coming where these things really do coalesce. We do collectively kind of wake up from the stupor that we found ourselves in. And as you and I have talked about, perhaps that moment doesn't come gently. You know, perhaps it comes with some, bit of alarm, because it may be alarm that is required for us to be kind of shaken out of the sort of trance that we find ourselves in. So, it's certainly going to be interesting. I'm glad we broke those cases down. I always wanted to kind of get into those in more detail with you. So that was really fun for me to get into that conversation. And we're coming to the end of the show. Really appreciate everybody, listening and joining us in this conversation. It's been a very, fulfilling for us to be along on this journey with you. We very much look forward to continuing the conversation, looking forward to what you might want to talk about. So if you have, interesting things that you would like us to discuss, please feel free to drop those in the comments. We do read all of them. And so we'd love to get into those conversation pieces in the future as well. So Darren, any final thoughts?
The one final thought I will share is that we talked earlier about having this larger understanding of who we are beyond what we are in this particular incarnation. What's fascinating, of course, and compelling is that is a message also conveyed by these beings very often, that even people who have experienced ontological shock will also talk about these beings saying that we feel sorry for you human beings because you've lost sight of who you truly are and how you're connected to everything else. And again, that inspired essence of being because of my clear conviction, which involves some of this communication with these others, that it's only by seeing ourselves in that larger context that we will be able to meet the challenges we face. That primarily all of these challenges we face come down to consciousness challenges. When we see ourselves in a more expansive way as eternal beings having an experience here, then you lose this feeling of scarcity. You lose this sense of everyone else being our adversary. So that interconnected feeling, that sense of being part of some much larger biome that isn't even delimited by space and time the way we think about it now, that is essential, and it's very interesting to me and compelling to me that has been a consistent message from so many of these others as well.
Hear to that. On that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.